On the surface, many of the traditional Final Fantasy games have been deep-rooted in high fantasy. There were mythological beasts that needed to be slain. The heroes and heroines would wield swords and shields and could cast magic, and there were plenty of kingdoms that could be explored. But Final Fantasy has also offered something more, as many storylines delved into the realm of science fiction. The original Final Fantasy featured time travel and futuristic technology, and Final Fantasy IV allowed for interplanetary expeditions with extraterrestrials present as both the antagonist and the savior. There was no guarantee that a Final Fantasy story would include these elements, but when Final Fantasy VII towed the line by having a more steampunk aesthetic that involved an extraterrestrial who became known as the Calamity from the Skies, it wasn't all that surprising. But unlike Final Fantasy IV, where an extraterrestrial called Zeromus served as the main antagonist, in Final Fantasy VII, Jenova did not adopt that role. Instead, Jenova was the instigator, a being that caused mass destruction in the past, but in the present served as a facilitator, as opposed to being an orchestrator. Owing to some localization issues, the true role of Jenova was shrouded in mystery for many years. But now that much more is known, and the distinction between Jenova and Sephiroth is much more clear, we are pleased to be able to explore Jenova with renewed vigour and intrigue. Throughout this video, we are going to explore the influence exerted by Jenova throughout the compilation of Final Fantasy VII, and we encourage you to stay with us until the end, as we analyse the impact Jenova had as a character. Little is known about when Jenova came into existence, or why there was a necessity to undertake an interplanetary expedition. But after leaving its home and travelling to a new planet, Jenova crash-landed on a meteor and caused significant disruption for the local inhabitants. Damage was caused to the planet's surface, and the flora and fauna in the nearby vicinity were eradicated. And as Jenova started to adapt to its new surroundings, it started to infect the planet and impose its will. In response, the planet's main populace, known as the Cetra, attempted to heal the wounds that had been caused, but as they gathered near the crash site, Jenova confronted them, and what would become a deadly conflict ensued. Due to its otherworldly power, Jenova was largely unaffected by the offensive actions of the Cetran people, and it was able to manipulate and deceive the Cetras, using shape-shifting abilities to sow seeds of doubt, while infecting them with a virus that could turn them into monsters. As their numbers started to dwindle, the Cetra became ever desperate. In response, the planet, now realizing that Jenova represented a major threat to its continued existence, created weapons. Enormous creatures of incredible power, weapons would have been the last line of defense for the planet. But before they could be activated, the few Cetra that remained, out of sheer desperation, managed to muster up the strength to seal Jenova inside the crater from which it had emerged. It no doubt led to a lot of jubilation amongst the Cetrans, but there was also a realization that it may only be a temporary reprieve, as Jenova had only been contained as opposed to defeated. In response, the weapons remained in stasis around the crater until such a time that they would be required again, and the Cetra returned to their homes and attempted to recover. In the millennia that followed, thanks to the efforts of the Cetra, the planet enjoyed a time of relative peace, but the conflict with Jenova had dealt a blow from which they would never recover. Too many Cetra had been slain due to the actions of Jenova, and they started to die out, their place in the world overtaken by inferior humans who hid away during the conflict with Jenova and were neither attuned to the wills of the planet or aware of the threat that lay dormant inside the northern crater. Approximately 2,000 years later, humanity started to reach a new level of technical maturity. The Shinra Electric Power Company spearheaded this sudden advancement in technology, and such was their desire to stay at the forefront of any developments and assert themselves as a global power that they pursued knowledge with limited regard for any consequences. The discovery of Mako, which Shinra industrialized and commoditized, was crucial. But just becoming the preeminent supplier of energy wasn't good enough. They craved more. And after learning about the Cetra, or Ancients as they had become known, and their so-called Promised Land, President Shinra empowered his subordinates to uncover the truths of what was believed to be an unlimited source of energy, as he felt it would be sufficient to fuel his dreams of building a utopia called Neo Midgar. As Shinra widened the net in their search for knowledge, the decision was taken to excavate the northern crater. The research teams found numerous things of interest, but the one thing that caught their eye above all else was the frozen remains of Jenova. Gast Faramis, who at the time was the head of the Shinra Science Research Department, led the examination, and he exhumed the remains of Jenova with a significant amount of intrigue and enthusiasm, because he, along with no doubt many other senior scientists, believed that Jenova was a Cetra. And if that were true, with the Cetra now believed to be extinct, it could help them to unlock the secrets of the Promised Land. What followed became known as the Jenova Project, and it could only be described as vile and repulsive. Gast initially led the way with his new wave of research, and he created two branches within the Jenova Project. Project G, which would be helmed by Dr. Hollander, and Project S, which would be helmed by Professor Hojo. Each project had the same objective, to create a new human-Cetra hybrid, and Jenova's remains were moved from the northern crater to Nibelheim in order to aid the research team's efforts. Project G, also known as Project Jillian, focused on Jillian Hewley. As a willing participant, Jillian was injected with Jenova's cells and was impregnated, with the theory being that the child she birthed would receive some of Jenova's traits. This method created Angeal Hewley, a strong individual who gained the ability to produce copies of himself and transfer abilities between donor and host. It also spawned G-type soldiers, who were created after being injected with Jillian's cells, and the most notable example of this approach was Genesis Rhapsodus. Project S, also known as Project Sephiroth, focused more on the fetus as opposed to the host. Hojo and Lucrezia Crescent, who was working as an assistant to Gast, theorized that they would have better results if they were more direct. And so, after it became known that Lucrezia was pregnant with Hojo's child, they both decided to inject Jenova's cells straight into the fetus. It led to Lucrezia having a torrid pregnancy, and she lamented her decision, but their experiment was a success. Sephiroth was born with enhanced abilities in a multitude of areas, and didn't display the same deficiencies as either Angeal or Genesis. As such, Project S was deemed superior, and became the basis for the development of Soldier, while Project G was considered surplus to requirements and shut down. Gast should have been impressed with their results, but after meeting Afalna and learning the truth about the sample they had excavated and then injected into these poor children, he stepped aside, absconding to conduct research on the Ancients in private. Due to his success with Project S, Hojo was promoted to fill the void left by Gast, and in this role, he continued to explore what was possible in relation to Jenova, and oversaw the enhancement of the Soldier program, which saw humans exposed to raw Mako energy. During this time, Hojo continued to hunt for Gast, and when the pair were reunited, Hojo was ruthless. Gast was murdered, his research was stolen, and his wife and child, the two remaining descendants of the Cetra, were kidnapped and taken back to Shinra headquarters for study. It was like a goldmine for Hojo. Gast's research contained meticulous notes and recorded footage about not just the Cetra, but also Jenova. And after learning the truth, Hojo was intrigued. He then used this knowledge to continue advancing the Soldier program, and back in Nibelheim, he sought to create new, more powerful beings by using the combined power of Jenova cells and Mako energy that was being siphoned from the nearby reactor. And this was the way things continued until the Nibelheim incident. On the 9th of September, in the second year of the New Era, Sephiroth, Zack, and Cloud, along with some other members of the Shinra infantry, were sent to Nibelheim to investigate a malfunction at the reactor. Inside, they saw machanoids, the result of Hojo's more recent heinous experiments, and Sephiroth was abhorred. But then came a stark realization. Sephiroth deduced that he was not so different from the abominations being grown by Hojo, and after immersing himself in the copious amounts of research that was left behind within the Nibelheim mansion, he torched the town and slaughtered many of the people who lived there. Sephiroth then attempted to retrieve Jenova, but was stopped by Cloud, and fell into the livestream while clutching Jenova's head. In the aftermath of what had been a brutal affair, only 2 individuals managed to escape from Shinra, Zangan and Tifa. Everyone else who remained and had survived, including Zack and Cloud, became part of a grand new experiment that would allow Hojo to put his reunion theory to the test. Hojo surmised, after studying Gast's research, and by continuing to conduct his own examinations, that Jenova, despite being frozen and remaining dormant, was still very much alive, and he believed that at one point, Jenova would attempt to reform by recalling her cells, something akin to a reunion. As such, Hojo injected the survivors of the Nibelheim incident with Jenova cells, something that created numerous clones, although many were rejected as failures due to poor mental and physical health. Even though Sephiroth had suffered grievous wounds at the hands of Cloud, his body could not be absorbed by the livestream due to the presence of Jenova cells, and Sephiroth used this opportunity to absorb the knowledge housed within the livestream, learning the truth about everything that had happened, including the power he had coursing through his veins. That power also threatened to consume him, and what followed was a battle of wills between Sephiroth and Jenova. But despite being the original source, Jenova's will was the one that ended up being broken. As a consequence, Jenova became subservient to Sephiroth, and 5 years after the Nibelheim incident, when Sephiroth attempted to enact his plan to be reborn and rule the planet, Jenova awakened as a willing and active participant. In the initial sense, the remains of Jenova, which had now been moved back to the Shinra headquarters following the Nibelheim incident, were broken out of their containment, and after mimicking the appearance of Sephiroth, Jenova then slaughtered numerous Shinra employees before ending the life of President Shinra. Jenova then fled the scene, but made sure to leave plenty of evidence around to ensure that Cloud and his allies would be encouraged to follow. And as Jenova traversed across the world towards the northern crater, it guided and manipulated Cloud into following the path that Sephiroth had laid out. As part of this, Jenova encountered Cloud aboard the cargo ship, and it was then Jenova who, under the command of Sephiroth, performed the devastating act of dropping down from the sky and murdering Aerith at the Forgotten City. Jenova then fulfilled its purpose inside the Whirlwind Maze. Just as Hojo had hypothesized, Jenova's cells attempted to return to its host, but instead of it being Jenova, the host was now Sephiroth. As such, instead of reabsorbing the cells, Jenova was instructed to murder most of the clones so that they would be sent into the livestream, something that would enable them to exert more control over the planet's systems. And when most of Jenova was destroyed inside the northern crater later on, as it attempted to stop the party from confronting Sephiroth, those cells were crucial in what ended up becoming Sephiroth's backup plan. Desperate to stop Meteor, the livestream was used to help save the planet, but as it fell back to Earth, many of the citizens who were touched ended up being infected with Jenova cells, something that led to them developing geostigma. Jenova also continued to live on in a physical sense, as a small part of its remains were recovered by Shinra. But after their ruse failed, those remains were used by Kadaj to try and bring Sephiroth back, something that did succeed before Sephiroth was again defeated and geostigma was cured by Aerith's healing rain. With the last of Jenova's cells seemingly destroyed, the extraterrestrial threat should have been eradicated, but Jenova was a very adaptable entity and had survived for millennia due to this trait, and based on that knowledge, it's difficult to say whether Jenova was indeed defeated at the conclusion of Advent Children, or whether it continued to persist within the livestream. No doubt, we will find out more about this as the new compilation of Final Fantasy VII explores Jenova in greater depth, and we cannot wait to see what new lore is shared. But for now, that concludes the story of Jenova, the original antagonist from Final Fantasy VII who set everything in motion. Compared to many of the other antagonists featured in Final Fantasy VII, and indeed the wider franchise, Jenova represents something quite different from what had been seen up until that point, and really everything that has been seen after. One of the common tropes within Final Fantasy narratives is for the perceived antagonist to be replaced by an even greater power, often at the last minute. We saw this in Final Fantasy 1, 3, 4 and 5, and have seen it since in Final Fantasy 8, 9, 10 and 13. On face value, that's what Jenova should have represented. It was the original source of antagonism for the planet, and even though it was ultimately contained, Jenova was incredibly powerful and still managed to cause the demise of the Cetra. It would have been logical to expect that as you reached the final stages of Final Fantasy VII, that it would have been reborn, ready to continue its war against the planet. As well, that's often the plot that we see. But that never happened, as instead of making Sephiroth attempt to resurrect Jenova as an underling, the writers decided to have it happen the opposite way round, with Jenova assimilated by Sephiroth and ending up as an underling. It meant the impact and role of Jenova was diminished, something that was exacerbated by mistranslations in the original script, which made it seem, for example, like it was Sephiroth who killed Aerith and President Shinra, as opposed to Jenova. You could argue that Jenova was acting on the orders of Sephiroth, but it was still Jenova who did the deed, and on that basis, it will be interesting to see how the story of Jenova is built out within the Final Fantasy VII Remake. Extra effort has already been placed on making Jenova more visible, as a new boss fight was placed after President Shinra had been killed, and within the VR simulator, there was some extra footage added about the calamity from the skies, and there is a definite curiosity about how this will be embellished upon in Part 2 and everything that follows. But yeah, with that small analysis out of the way, that marks the end of this Final Fantasy VII Origins video. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please do hit that like button, share it around to all the people you know who love Final Fantasy VII, and if you haven't done so already, please subscribe to our channel. Also, be sure to let us know what Jenova means to you as a character in the comments, and let us know if there's anyone you'd like us to cover next. Alright guys, this is Daryl signing out. A big thanks to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Raining Eckham, Logan Nijay, Benjamin Snow and Gregory, and of course, a big thanks to all of you for joining me on this deep dive into the lore of Final Fantasy VII. I hope to see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.